Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you so very much for all the feedback I got and all the many questions I got from my last video about how to use those watercolor pencils that came in that really great set from Stampin' Up called Nature's Paintings Kit. And if you haven't got this yet, so that's a good starter kit if you're a newbie to watercolor pencils. Now I decided, because I got so many questions about the papers and the colors and maybe a few more ideas on how to use them, and I decided to make a couple more smaller videos. I know the last one was almost an hour, but sometimes when you explain something it takes a little bit longer. So I decided to just chop it up and we do a couple of different segments. This one will be just the basics about papers, and I will show you a few things that you should look out for when you're working with these. So other than that, we will go over a couple of ideas how to use those, a few tips on how to color so it looks a little bit more three-dimensional. But overall, I'm trying to keep them a little bit shorter than the hour we had the last time. So let's talk about papers. In this kit, you get these pre-printed images, which is really great. And as I told you in the other video, there are 2 blank pages in here, and I already grabbed one and did my little color swap. And I know many of you were like, this is a great idea, and I can't not stress this more enough than try and make yourself a swap with colors so you know how your pencils are reacting. You know if there's one that has a little bit behavior issue, as I call it. And I will show you how to make these still work, but make sure that you're gonna do a little swap. But for now, there's one extra page, and this is the paper that came in this set. Now, mind you, this is watercolor paper, but it is a very thin one. It's not your typical watercolor paper. A typical watercolor paper, let me move this aside. Stampin' Up has one here. It's called Fluid 100. This is a very good paper, and I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but it is very wavy, so it has a lot of texture to it, and that is typical for watercolor paper. And when you compare it to this one, not only is the color difference there, but you also have this side is a, and it doesn't matter which side I turn it, it is a lot smoother. So 2 different papers, and they react different when we use them. So I'm gonna keep those here, put this aside, and then I have my go-to. Now this comes on a block, and as you can see, this is normally this thick. I'm down to not much. This is an older version. I know the color looks different. It's Canson watercolor paper, and I'm using the watercolor paper. So there are mixed media and other papers, but I'm using the watercolor paper, and that watercolor paper looks like this. So it is comes on a big sheet here, and there are different sizes. This is 9 by 12, and I just cut mine down to a little bit more smaller size to handle. And we will do the same with the Stampin' Up watercolor paper. In actuality, let me quick cut this down by half. So how long is it? It is 7, so 3.5. So we're just making 2 out of this one. And as you can see, it's a little bit thicker. And before we start, let's make our papers, mark them so we know which one is what. So this is Stampin' Up. Okay, so I'm gonna put the swatch part on the side for now. So I will work with these 4 different watercolor papers and regular cardstock. So 3 watercolor papers, and 1 is just your regular basic white cardstock. And I marked them so we will remember, because at one point I can tell you they're gonna go all over the place. And the first thing we want to do, just to show you how these papers react to water. Let's try this on the bottom here. So this is regular watercolor paper, and my brush is relatively saturated, so I'm using a big amount of water, and there's some pigment in there, but that is fine. And we do the same here. You can actually see the amount of water that is put on here. And we do one more. And I'm just gonna lift this entire thing up. So you can see here, I used the same amount of water on this strip down on the bottom here on all three. And that was a decent size, and there's still some water sitting on here. So watercolor paper, I'm sorry about the noises. I know my chair is paid off, but it just has a squeaky spot. So looking at the paper on the bottom here, I can see there's still some standing water. Here's a little bit. This one is almost completely soaked in. So let's go over a second time. And like I said, I'm not even wiping the water off. I'm just dipping it in, and whatever is on the brush, we will put on down on the paper here. Okay, and now we let this dry. So you will see what I was trying to, or what I'm trying to show you is that these papers here, these are both the thicker watercolor paper, will absorb a lot more water than this thinner watercolor paper, or as our cardstock. And you can tell already, so there's still water on here, and this is our cardstock. And when you flip it around, you can see how it seeped already through the paper, and it makes it really, really mushy. So this is what happens when you use a lot of water on your regular cardstock. Now, regular cardstock is not meant to be used with a lot of water, but just for learning purposes, we're gonna do this. So here's still some water on here. It is not all the way through, but I can see it starts wobbling a little bit. Not as much as our cardstock is, but it does, because it is a thinner surface. Now these two, on the other hand, have water still sitting on them. You can't see anything on the back side, and you can't see any warping right now of the paper either. So, which means, and I'm just gonna take off what is left here. And so you can see the water really didn't do any damage to this paper. It's a little bit wet still, but no damage to it. This one here absorbed and was holding up pretty good, but I can tell you right now, just going over it, it starts to frizzle a little bit on top here. So the surface is getting, from all the water, a little bit rough. And if you would add more to it, I'm sure it will get these little fuzzies and then disintegrate. While this one, actually, you can see already here how the paper is, and I hope the camera catches it. Let me move my light here a little bit. Maybe this helps. So you really can see how roughed up this paper is. But that doesn't mean we can't use this for watercolors, especially not the pencils. So this is how the different ways how these papers behave. Now, what does it look when we add our watercolor pencils to them? And I will take a couple of colors. And remember the chart that I made, the little swap, so I know which ones were flowing really nicely. And I need something that you can see pretty good, so we might use the Berry Burst, maybe the Coastal Cabana and the red, or the orange. We'll see. One of these, but they were all working pretty good. So next thing I'm gonna do, we're just gonna make a little circle on here. And I'm using the same pressure on all of these. And while you can't feel the texture of the paper, I do feel that this one is a lot smoother than these two are. And so is this one. Let's try this again. And you will see when you look up close the difference between them in a second. Okay, then we have one more. Let's do a little brown. Okay, now when you look at these two, you can tell that they are very rough in texture. And let me stand up so I can see what I'm holding in the camera. There you go. So you can actually see pretty good here the texture of the paper. You can also see how not so smooth these colorings are that I put on there. While when we're comparing these two, so this is the regular cardstock, this is the watercolor paper that was in the kit. This one has a little roughness. This is a lot smoother because this is a really nice smooth surface. So all four together, you can tell a little bit just by the texture. And I should put this at the end because this is the smoothest of those three. So they're all different. Now when we add water to them, let me do this standing. It's gonna be a little challenge, but let's see. So I'm adding water to it. And I'm pulling this water out, the color out. And I'm using a lot of water because this is watercolor paper. I'm doing a little bit more here. And now I already know that the other two papers are a little bit thinner, so I'm not gonna use as much water, a little bit less. And here too. Now you can see that they all flow, but the watercolor paper definitely shows, shows more defined gradation. It shows more how the colors really dissolve nicely on here. This one is a little bit harder. And then this one is our cardstock. And here again, so where the color sits, you hit it with water, but the amount of water is important here when you're working with a thinner paper, because the more water you add to it, the quicker it will go through the paper since it's thin, and it's harder to get these lines off and spread the paper, the color around. So this is something we have to keep in mind if we're working with thinner paper, like this one that comes in the Nature Paintings kit, or with regular cardstock. While the watercolor paper, I'm not really worried. I can actually go back with a little bit of water and even smoothen this one out here. And you can see it really makes a difference how far you can spread. Now that doesn't mean when you're working with these pencils that you always have to use watercolor paper. If you want to experience and play a little bit with thicker paper, I would suggest getting the Stampin' Up! Fluid 100 package. It's got like 10 sheets, I think, in it. It's a great paper. It works great. It has a nice texture to it. Not as deep as the one from the Canson, but you don't really need that. So that would be a great add-on. And when you're practicing with this paper, since you're getting this fine detail brush, as I showed you in the beginner video, you want to use just a minimum of water. You don't want to use a big brush with a lot of water, because this paper still is too thin for that technique. So let's see how the other two will be doing. And I'm just, this one I'm gonna load my brush and I'm going over the edge here a little bit and then just spreading it out. And you can tell here, even with a lot of water, it's not a big deal. And we can go later back. And thin the shadowing out. So these both work really nice. While these ones, we need to reduce the water. So now I got rid of a lot of water on my brush, and you can see here how this is now moving a lot better, while this one still gives us a little bit of a trouble. And what happens is, if you go over this one, and I do this on purpose now, over and over again, you can see how the surface is starting to disintegrate. So definitely, when you're using regular cardstock, you have to be careful not to use a ton of water, but it can work. And here we have our second one, and then we do this side. So definitely, when you're working with a lot of watercolor paper, the nature paintings is great too, but still be careful with the amount of water you're using. And before we finish up with this little tutorial about the different papers and textures to it, when you're doing your little swatches, so this is on the paper, and I would suggest you do this on the paper that you will be using the most with your watercoloring pencils. Now this one comes with the set, so I would use that one for sure, but you might want to just grab yourself an extra piece of paper if you planning on, for example, using a lot of cardstock. Now over the years, I can show you, I have a ton of different watercolor pencils. The majority is Faber-Castell, because years ago they came in a set where you got multiple colors all together in one set, and I just added to them because we use them a lot in my card making classes. There is some Staedtler in here. There are some old close to my heart watercolor pencils in here, and they all work great. But what I did with all of them, I made myself a little color swaps, and I just used, and this was just plain cardstock. This was Daisy, White Daisy from Close to My Heart. And as you can see, I just put either down the name, or I put the number down and the company, and I did the same that I did with these little squares. So I started with some scribbles, and then I added water to it just to observe how well they flow. How well are they behaving when you add water to them? Is there one that's a little bit harsher, that needs a little bit more attention? And on top, what does the color look like? So these are well loved, and they are many, many years old, but they are still a go-to for me, because let's say, so this one tells me it's a Faber-Castell 133. And when I show you the 133 in the end of this one, you will go like, wow, that doesn't look anything like the one you just showed us. If I can find it. Yeah, so this is 133. It has a very dark ending, but this is actually the color you get when you add water to it. So it is the same. I mean, you can tell the color, but it is a totally different texture. If you think that this will be a nice dark one, you have to apply a lot of different layers to get a really dark color. This one is 136. This is a little bit closer, but there are some in there that I'm like, okay, this is not the color at all. 123. So this is this one down here. So this is actually a little bit more pinkish. And so make sure when you get your new pencils to give them a try first, a test run. Try to put a little bit more pressure on them. Try to put a little bit lighter pressure, then add water. And when you're working with this paper and your regular cardstock, make sure that your brush is not super wet. So as I showed you here in this one, I like to just dip them in, wipe them off, and then I always test on the back of my hand to get a feeling on how wet they are. So this one here is just misty. It's not super wet. It doesn't leave big lines of water anywhere. I can feel the water, but it's not super wet. And that will be perfect to use on this paper as well as on regular cardstock. Now, when you add a lot of color to this, then you might need at one point a little bit more water. But I would suggest being a little bit light-handed, let it dry, and then rather go over it again if you feel like you need more. But we will go into those when we talk about the coloring again and what you can do with the different techniques that I'm going to show you. All right, so this is it for today. A little bit just one-on-one about the different papers. And if you plan on buying yourself some watercolor paper on top of this little piece, make sure, I would suggest get the SU fluid, the Stampin' Up! Fluid 100 watercolor paper. This is great. It works great if you don't want to buy a big block of the Canson one. This is in your kit, and this is just your plain cardstock. So I would say one more thing maybe before we close the paper, because since we are talking about paper and different textures, so stamping on images. We have a lot of stamps with images where we want to color them in, but there's something you have to be aware of as well when you're stamping your images. Now, Stampin' Up! Uses Memento ink for all your stamped images that will be colored in with markers. And that's because this is not an alcohol-based ink. It is a water-based ink. So the alcohol markers and the ink will not react with each other. If you would stamp something with this ink on any of these papers and you go over with a brush and water, you will smudge your image because this is water-based. When you add water to it, it will run. Now, we still can stamp with this ink on these papers, but there is a technique that I will show you on how to avoid getting, you know, the bleeding from your stamped image. The other thing you might want to be aware of is if you're stamping on coarse paper like the watercolor paper, which is very bumpy, if you have a very delicate stamp, it might not give you a perfect impression because of the ups and downs and all the valleys and those little uneven spots. If you stamp on this paper, that should be fine. This is very smooth, and naturally your basic white is a smooth paper, so that's not a problem. But any image you stamp on here which has a very detailed stamp or it's very delicate, be aware that you might not get a full impression of it. So two things you can stamp with when you're using watercolor pencils. You can use StazOn ink, which I personally am not a big fan of because you need a special cleaner, and it's sometimes very harsh to your acrylic stamps because of the special cleaner and everything. But StazOn ink, you can stamp on it and it will not smudge because it is not water-based. I like Memento. Let it dry, best overnight. And I will show you in the next video how we can color in and not get this to bleed. All right, so see you in the next video, and I hope you enjoyed so far what you learned today. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.